The ringing silence wasn't a relief. It was the second stage of the ambush. The mortar rounds had stopped tearing the canopy. The frantic, high-pitched scream of the NVA charging horn had faded, and now only the sound of hot brass cooling in the mud remained, ticking like 1,000 tiny clocks counting down their lives. Sergeant Reyes pressed his face into the wet earth, the smell of cordite and decaying vegetable matter clogging his sinuses. His ears were useless, still roaring from the 7.62 fire that had shattered their patrol formation a half hour ago. They were supposed to be Fire Team Alpha, a quick sweep and reconnaissance mission on the perimeter of the Bong San clearing, but now they were just 3 broken men staring into the suffocating green. Private Miller, the RTO, lay trembling beside him, one hand clamped over the shattered PRC-77 radio, the other clutching his M16 like a prayer bead. The rest of the company was gone, scattered, dead, or retreating toward the distant, unseen river. Reyes didn't need the useless radio to know they were ghosts now, isolated 20 clicks behind the supposed line, the jungle swallowing their footsteps and muffling their cries. The silence was the enemy's main weapon here, heavier than any rocket launcher. It amplified everything: the frantic thumping of Reyes's own heart against the clay, the acidic metallic tang of blood seeping from the scratch on Miller's forearm, the agonizingly loud clink when Corporal Jensen, the machine gunner, shifted his M60 and accidentally nudged a spent casing. Reyes knew that the NVA, or perhaps the Viet Cong local forces, were listening for exactly that sound. They specialized in the hunt, not the fight. They preferred the slow, meticulous application of dread. Reyes slowly lifted his head, allowing only his eyes to scan the immediate perimeter. The light here was a permanent, sickly emerald shade, filtered through 3 layers of vegetation, making every shadow long and misleading. Sweat mixed with mud and gun oil stung his eyes. He signaled "move out" with 3 deliberate taps on Miller's shoulder, keeping his movement low, fluid, trying to become part of the mud and roots. They couldn't stay where they were. The enemy knew the ambush site intimately. Reyes pulled the useless radio antenna down, hoping the lack of static might fool anyone listening in, a small, irrational gesture of defiance against the hopelessness of their communication breakdown. Their survival now depended entirely on moving south, into the densest, most unforgiving part of the triple-canopy jungle, toward a high-ground ridge that might offer a chance at extraction, provided anyone even knew they were alive. Every muscle in his body screamed at the prospect of the grueling trek, but the thought of the silent, unseen eyes watching them from the shadows was a far greater motivator. They had 2 days of rations, maybe 100 rounds between the 3 rifles, and 1 functional M60 with half a belt. Reyes knew those were just numbers. What truly mattered was how long their nerves would last against the jungle's oppressive quiet. The retreat was less a tactical maneuver and more a desperate slither. Jensen, known as Bull for his stubbornness and his capability to carry the heavy M60 through hell itself, took point, his massive frame oddly silent as he navigated the thick, thorny undergrowth. Reyes watched his rear, and Miller struggled to keep pace in the middle, still visibly vibrating with shock. The physical weight of the equipment was nothing compared to the psychological burden they carried, the knowledge that they were actively being tracked, not just passively observed. The air was thick, suffocating. Breathing felt like trying to suck moisture out of a sponge. The humidity turned their uniforms into heavy, abrasive shrouds. After nearly an hour of this agonizingly slow movement, the only sound was the persistent buzz of jungle insects and the amplified sounds of their own laboring lungs. Reyes felt the familiar tickle of paranoia begin to creep up his spine. He stopped Jensen with a raised fist. They had crossed a small, barely perceptible game trail, likely used by the enemy for rapid movement through the area. Reyes dropped to one knee, ignoring the leash that immediately attached itself to his neck. He didn't look at the ground for footprints. The enemy here were too professional for that carelessness. He looked higher at the way the foliage was disturbed, and there it was, not a mistake, but a deliberate, almost artistic signal. 3 small, broken branches, each one snapped at a precise 45-degree angle, pointing subtly toward their direction of travel. They were partially obscured by a hanging vine, placed just high enough that only a soldier actively searching for abnormalities would see them. It was a signature, a mocking message. I know where you are going. Jensen saw it too, his face, already slick with sweat, hardening into granite. The Ghost, he whispered, the name of the legendary NVA tracker known for his surgical efficiency and unnerving silence, hanging in the air like poison gas. Reyes had dismissed the stories as propaganda, tales of a phantom operative who could move silently through a field of drying leaves. Now, seeing this meticulous signpost, the stories seemed terrifyingly real. They doubled back 10 yards, plunging straight off the known trail and into a thicket of razor grass, choosing pain and obscurity over the relative ease of the path. They moved with renewed desperation, forcing themselves to ignore the stinging cuts and the mud that now encased their boots. Reyes knew that every noise they made, the rustle of webbing, the accidental scraping of a rifle stock against bamboo, was being cataloged by the unseen hunter. They were no longer soldiers moving through a jungle, they were prey in a massive living cage, and the hunter seemed to enjoy letting them run just far enough to exhaust themselves before the final, silent kill. They found temporary refuge inside a natural, bowl-shaped depression, hidden beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient banyan tree. The air inside the bowl was stagnant, smelling heavily of damp earth and the sickly sweet odor of rotting tropical flowers. But the thick roots offered structural protection from overhead observation. As dusk began to bleed into the jungle, turning the emerald light into a suffocating charcoal gray, the psychological warfare intensified. They hadn't heard a single shot, hadn't seen a shadow move that wasn't their own, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. Reyes distributed their meager rations, 2 lukewarm canteens, 3 packs of flavorless survival biscuits, and 1/2 tin of sea-ration peaches, which they saved for morale. As they ate in silence, the quiet was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets that sounded unnaturally loud and close. Reyes pulled out a water-stained map fragment, illuminating it dimly with his compass's tritidium dial. He pointed to the next major landmark, Hill 102, a steep ascent that was probably littered with booby traps, but offered the only clear shot at communicating with the high command if they could get their auxiliary radio working. Jensen, resting his massive gun across his knees, finally spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The Ghost isn't supposed to be real, Sarge, just something they tell the FNGs." Reyes nodded slowly. "The men who survived him tell the stories, Bull. He operates alone, moves faster than a patrol, and knows every inch of this valley better than we know the inside of our barracks. They say he never uses a full clip, always one shot, one kill, aimed through the throat or the eye. The worst part, though, is how he does it. They say you never hear him approach. The first time you know he's there is when the sound of his shot is echoing away and your buddy is already dead." This account was meant to explain the threat, but it only amplified Miller's terror. Miller, the youngest of the team and barely 6 months in country, started scratching frantically at a non-existent insect bite on his arm. His paranoia was a tangible thing, vibrating in the small hideout. Reyes noticed Miller was constantly checking the safety on his M16, a nervous tic that threatened to give them away. They were running not just from the tracker, but from their own collapsing mental state. The lack of sleep compounded the issue. They had to maintain a rotating watch, but the jungle's oppressive, featureless darkness made the effort almost useless. Reyes watched Miller stare into the gloom, certain the young soldier was seeing things that weren't there, and realized that if they didn't break this silence soon, if they didn't hear a friendly helicopter, or, God forbid, even the sound of an enemy patrol, the silence itself would kill them long before the Ghost ever pulled a trigger. He calculated their remaining resources, enough energy for maybe another 12 hours of heavy movement. After that, exhaustion and dehydration would turn them into slow, stumbling targets. The night shift was a relentless, grinding torture. Every creak of the banyan roots, every drop of water hitting the leaf litter sounded like a platoon flanking their position. They maintained the silent watch, Reyes covering the final, critical hours before dawn. Just as the first, faint hint of blue-gray light attempted to pierce the canopy, the psychological tension snapped. It wasn't a gunshot that broke the calm, but the awful, muffled thud of flesh hitting wet earth, followed by a soft, guttural sigh. Jensen, who had been sleeping in a tight, curled ball beside Reyes, bolted upright, his eyes wide and vacant. Miller, who had just been relieved from watch, was gone from his spot 10 feet away, which was now filled only with the unsettling emptiness of his absence. Reyes immediately swung his rifle toward the sound, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. He whispered Miller's name, low and urgent. Nothing. Reyes and Jensen crawled painstakingly toward where Miller had been, their movements excruciatingly slow, punctuated by the agonizing scrape of their gear against the roots. When Reyes reached the spot, he found Miller lying perfectly still, eyes open and staring blankly up at the pre-dawn canopy. There was no blood on his uniform, no visible wound, only a tiny, almost surgical slit at the base of his throat, precisely where the carotid artery lay. He hadn't bled out instantly. The killer had ensured he died quietly, drowning internally, without making a sound that might alert the others. The radio, still uselessly strapped to Miller's back, was tilted slightly, the antenna deliberately and cleanly cut in half, the exposed wire ends wrapped neatly around the remaining stalk. It wasn't just a kill, it was a performance, a deliberate message that confirmed every terrible rumor about the ghost. He hadn't just taken Miller's life, he had taken their last hope of communication and done it within arm's reach, proving his uncanny ability to melt into the immediate terrain. Jensen gagged, clapping a hand over his mouth. He was seeing the myth made horribly real. The sniper hadn't used a heavy caliber rifle, which would have made noise and damage. He had used a blade, or perhaps a garrote, confirming that the ghost was a tracker, a hunter, operating at impossibly close range, reveling in the absolute silence of his trade. Reyes grabbed Miller's dog tags, forcing himself to look away from the young man's eternally startled expression. They had to move. Leaving the body was the hardest command Reyes had ever issued, a violation of the soldier's sacred code, but to linger was to join Miller. They stripped the dead man of his remaining ammunition and water, the grotesque necessity of survival overriding the deep-seated grief. The ghost was mocking them, proving they were surrounded by his patience, and the knowledge that the hunter had spent the night watching them sleep, choosing exactly when and how to strike, was the most terrifying realization of all. The sun finally broke through, bathing the jungle in a false sense of security, but Reyes knew the light only made them easier targets for the eyes that never seemed to blink.
The decision to leave Miller's body behind cemented the corrosive cynicism that had been eating away at Reyes for weeks. It was a cold, pragmatic calculus. A two-man team could move faster, quieter, and present a smaller target profile than a team burdened by a corpse. But the act itself felt like a surrender to the dehumanizing logic of the jungle. As they moved, heading directly up the unforgiving slope of Hill 102, the silence of their departure felt heavier than the weight of their packs. Jensen, usually stoic, was now talking to himself in low, ragged breaths, his conversation a mash of deployment dates, home addresses, and mechanical specifics of the M60. He was trying to tether himself to reality using mundane facts, but the anchor was slipping. Reyes watched him, recognizing the early stages of combat fatigue morphing into full-blown panic disorder. The loss of Miller wasn't just the loss of a comrade, it was the final shattering of the illusion that careful adherence to training could protect them. How do you fight an enemy that operates in absolute silence and seems capable of dissolving and reforming at will? Reyes paused, using the pretense of checking his compass to catch his breath. The ascent was brutal, the terrain turning from muddy basin into treacherous shale and exposed root systems. He looked back down the slope, not expecting to see anything, but needing to affirm that they were moving away from the site of the horror. He saw only the unchanging wall of green. This constant, unyielding pressure, the knowledge that a man who could kill silently 10 feet away was now merely trailing them, was the true definition of psychological warfare. It was designed to make them betray themselves, to force a mistake through exhaustion or noise. And Reyes knew that the stakes were no longer about the objective, getting to the ridge, but about maintaining the fragile structure of their minds. He wondered, briefly, what the men back home, watching blurry news footage, could possibly understand about this war. It wasn't about heroic charges or clear lines of fire. It was about the slow, silent erosion of the human soul. If the war breaks a soldier by making him choose between survival and humanity, which choice is the unforgivable one? Reyes looked at Jensen, whose eyes were darting wildly between the foliage. Jensen chose survival, but the choice was killing him internally, and the only remaining humanity Reyes clung to was the obligation to get Jensen out alive. He needed to focus Jensen, give him a concrete task, something mechanical to ground him before the fear consumed him entirely. He handed Jensen the last of their purification tablets and instructed him to refill their canteens at the next runoff. It was a useless chore, given their low water levels, but the routine was a lifeline against the paralyzing dread. This psychological hell, this waiting for the silent blade, was a far more effective weapon than any bomb. It made the soldiers turn inward, questioning their senses, their judgment, and eventually their loyalties. They were trapped in the emerald hell, and the silence was its warden. Reyes pressed on, focusing only on the next route, the next step, refusing to acknowledge the heavy, suffocating weight of Miller's ghost walking just behind them. The climb up Hill 102 was a study in slow, painful desperation. Every yard was contested by thick vegetation that seemed engineered to snag their rifle barrels and tear their skin. Jensen had stopped speaking entirely, now communicating only through strained grunts and signals. His movements had become jerky, less coordinated, suggesting severe fatigue and the onset of heat exhaustion despite the minimal distance they had covered. Reyes felt his own alertness waning. The 48 hours of near-constant operational stress, coupled with the horrific clarity of Miller's execution, had worn down his reserves. They stopped in a small, relatively clear pocket under a giant fern, shielded from any direct view from below. Reyes pulled out the remaining radio gear, the aux receiver Miller had been carrying, which miraculously hadn't been destroyed. He started attempting to jury-rig a connection using a piece of discarded comm wire and the tiny, intact antenna stub. He needed to find a clear frequency, a long shot in this dense electronic environment, but the effort was necessary to stave off the complete sense of abandonment. As Reyes worked, his hands slick with sweat, Jensen began the meticulous process of stripping down the M60. This was his coping mechanism, the repetitive, highly specific task of cleaning and oiling the weapon, checking the feed tray, ensuring every moving part was immaculate. It was a mechanical prayer. But today, the routine offered no comfort. Jensen fumbled the bolt carrier group. It hit the dirt with a soft, sickening thud. Both men froze instantly. The sound, insignificant in a civilian context, felt like a thunderclap in the jungle's oppressive quiet. Reyes hissed a curse, but the damage was done. They waited, suspended in that agonizing instant, listening for any return noise, a twig snap, a cough, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being pulled back. Nothing, only the deafening background hum of insects. Reyes quickly retrieved the component and silently handed it back to Jensen, whose face was gray with shame and fear. Reyes forced his eyes to scan the higher ridgeline, seeking the source of the silence. Was the ghost waiting for them to reach the summit, guaranteeing them maximum exposure, or was he circling below, enjoying their anxiety? Suddenly, Jensen pointed, not with a hand, but with the subtle movement of his eyes toward a patch of thick, flowering vines 20 feet to their left. Reyes followed the gaze. At first, he saw only flowers, large, vibrant purple blooms. Then he saw the aberration. Woven meticulously into the dense floral pattern was a thin, almost invisible strand of monofilament fishing line, stretched taut between two stalks. It was placed exactly at neck level. A tripwire, designed not for an explosive, but simply to trip a soldier, sending him tumbling down the steep slope straight into a pre-selected kill zone or onto bamboo punji stakes. It was the work of a sadist with unlimited patience. The ghost wasn't just tracking them, he was actively shaping their movements, funneling them like water into a prepared container. The sheer proximity of the trap, placed where they might naturally rest, indicated that the hunter had passed through this spot maybe minutes before they arrived. Reyes knew they had to bypass it, but the discovery forced them into a difficult, noisy maneuver around the thick undergrowth, guaranteeing they would break the silence again. This was the trap, the forced choice between noise and death,
a choice Reyes knew the ghost was counting on them to make.
The confrontation came not through a blinding flash of gunfire, but through a calculated maneuver that amplified their fear. They had to move left to avoid the wire, forcing them into a densely packed area of thorny rattan. As they negotiated the treacherous footing, Reyes decided they had to break the pattern. They could not continue to be led by the nose. He decided to turn the silent hunt into an open, loud conflict, a choice born of desperation. He pulled out their single remaining smoke grenade, a rusted olive-drab cylinder, and whispered his plan to Jensen. A 3-count toss into the dense thicket directly above the area where they believed the ghost was operating, followed by a mad dash toward the ridgeline, using the sudden noise and visual cover to escape the funnel. Reyes pulled the pin. 1, 2, 3. He hurled the grenade upward. It arced high, disappearing into the leaves, and detonated with a sharp, welcome poof. A thick plume of vibrant violet smoke immediately boiled outward, creating a beautiful but deadly cloud that obscured the upper slope. The color was entirely deliberate, a desperate signal that would hopefully be visible above the canopy, even if it risked attracting more immediate danger. Jensen opened fire immediately, emptying a short, deliberate burst of the M60 into the smoke, the sound of the machine gun tearing the oppressive silence to shreds. They ran, scrambling up the steep grade, using the sheer volume of the noise as temporary camouflage. The unexpected, ear-splitting sound of the heavy machine gun was their rebellion against the silence. But the ghost was ready. The return fire was not from the smoke, nor was it the heavy automatic fire they expected from an NVA unit. It was a single shot, clean and impossibly accurate, that whisked past Jensen's head and chipped a piece of stone from a boulder directly in front of Reyes' face. The shot had not come from the flank or from below, but from high up on the opposite ridge, hundreds of meters away, a location they hadn't even considered compromised. The single shot was a warning, a sign that the ghost was not restricted to the immediate vicinity and his patience was not broken by their desperate gamble. It meant he had secured a vantage point with unlimited view, waiting for them to break cover. Reyes dove for the dirt, pulling Jensen down with him. The M60's roar ceased, replaced instantly by the terrible quiet, now laced with the metallic taste of terror. They were exposed, exhausted, and now convinced that every move they made had been anticipated. They crawled into a shallow crevice, gasping for air. The smoke was already dissipating, the vibrant violet fading into the distant green, and the only proof that their desperate attack had failed was the unwavering, absolute silence that returned, proving the ghost was still waiting, still watching, still in control of their slow, painful demise. Reyes realized the true horror. The ghost hadn't just predicted the noise, he had encouraged it, knowing it would reveal their true position and panic them into the final fatal mistake. The failure of the ambush attempt was the catalyst for the final, catastrophic break in Jensen's already frayed sanity. The heavy gunner, who had always been the physical foundation of the team, collapsed in the crevice, his breathing shallow and erratic. He started muttering, not about the war or the enemy, but about the smell of his mother's kitchen back in Omaha, about the impossible whiteness of snow, details utterly alien to the suffocating heat and green surrounding them. His eyes glazed over, fixed on a point far above the canopy, seeing things Reyes couldn't. The lack of water and sleep, combined with the extreme psychological stress, had pushed him past the edge. Reyes tried to shake him, to get him to focus, but Jensen merely smiled, a terrifying slack-jawed grin. "He's right there, Sarge!" Jensen slurred, pointing to an empty patch of air 6 feet away. "Standing right there, waiting for us to stop running." Reyes knew this was it. They had lost the fight against the environment and their own minds. He tried to ration the last spoonfuls of water, pressing the canteen against Jensen's cracked lips, but Jensen slapped it away, mistaking the canteen for the phantom enemy. In a terrifying instant, Jensen lunged, not at Reyes, but at the M60, wrenching the heavy gun up and leveling it at the spot he imagined the ghost standing. "Get out! Get out of my damn perimeter!" Jensen screamed, his voice raw, shattering the fragile quiet. Reyes knew that if Jensen fired the M60 wildly now, they would both be dead within seconds, attracting every enemy within a half-mile radius and giving the ghost the perfect, noisy target. Reyes reacted with brutal necessity. He slammed the butt of his M16 into the side of Jensen's temple, a jarring, sickening impact that was loud enough to confirm their position to anyone listening.
Jensen dropped like a stone, the M60 clattering uselessly beside him. The blow was enough to stun him into unconsciousness, saving their lives, but the sound of the impact seemed to echo endlessly down the slope, a blatant signal in the overwhelming silence. Reyes felt a wave of nausea and grief. He had just disabled his last functional comrade, ensuring that if the ghost attacked now, he would be facing him entirely alone. He secured the M60, removing the ammunition belt and throwing it into a cluster of vines as a tactical precaution, then began the painful process of dragging Jensen. They couldn't stay here. The noise of the rifle butt and Jensen's screams were too great. Reyes checked the map again. They were tantalizingly close to the ridge, maybe 30 minutes of crawling ascent. He looked at the unconscious, heavy weight of Jensen, then at the impenetrable green. He made the final, terrifying calculation. Leave the M60, take the heavy gunner, and make a desperate, noisy rush for the summit. The silence was over. Now their only chance lay in sheer velocity and a final, suicidal burst of energy, trading the psychological dread for raw, terrifying combat.
The final approach to the ridgeline was a desperate, stumbling crawl. Reyes dragged Jensen, who was regaining consciousness but remaining mostly silent, muttering only half-formed words. Reyes' own body was screaming in protest. His shoulders burned, his knees were scraped raw, and the persistent throb in his temple from lack of sleep felt like a bass drum beating out his impending failure. He forced himself to ignore the pain, focusing only on the coordinates of the extraction point, a small dry riverbed just over the peak of Hill 102. It was their last hope, the only terrain feature open enough for a possible emergency dust-off. Reyes knew the ghost was closer now, drawn in by the noise of the previous confrontation. He could feel the anticipation in the air, the calm before the inevitable final storm. He had to assume that the enemy had already triangulated their position and was setting up the final kill zone on the ridgeline. He realized he needed a diversion, a final act of noise and light to break the silent stranglehold. He still had one illumination flare left, a massive magnesium candle designed to turn night into day. It was meant to signal friendlies, but he decided to use it as bait. He managed to secure Jensen behind a thick boulder cluster near the summit, warning him with a fierce whisper not to move no matter what happened. Then Reyes crept forward, hugging the earth, crawling through the exposed shale until he reached the very edge of the ridge. He heard it then. Not a sound, but the absence of sound, where there should have been the rustling of leaves or the settling of dirt. The ghost was directly ahead, perfectly hidden, waiting for Reyes to clear the crest. Reyes pulled the pin on the flare. He didn't toss it, he aimed it directly at the spot where he felt the presence radiating, a thicket of tangled vines and heavy bushes just 10 feet below the summit. The flare ignited with a ferocious, blinding white flash and a deafening, sustained whoosh. The magnesium fire instantly ripped through the leaves, consuming them in a brilliant, violent burst of light and noise, turning the jungle around them into an agonizingly bright, monochrome landscape. The silence was obliterated, replaced by the roar of the burning magnesium and the sudden, overwhelming white light. Reyes rolled immediately backward, firing a 3-round burst from his M16 into the center of the blinding light. He heard a sharp, human cry, a guttural sound of surprise and pain, followed by the distinct sound of a rifle hitting rock. The ghost had been hit, or at least startled out of his uncanny patience. This was the moment. Reyes scrambled back to Jensen, pulling the heavier man to his feet. "We run, Bull, we run now!" They stumbled over the crest, leaving the burning magnesium behind, sprinting recklessly down the treacherous backside of the hill, sacrificing stealth for speed. The enemy had been broken, momentarily, by the sheer overwhelming noise and light, proving that even the legendary ghost was vulnerable to total sensory overload. But Reyes knew the reprieve was fleeting. The ghost would recover, and the entire NVA patrol would now know their precise location. The race was now against time, noise, and distance.
The descent down the backside of Hill 102 was a controlled freefall. Reyes and Jensen tumbled more often than they ran, their bodies propelled by gravity and sheer panic. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping them upright, overriding the exhaustion and Jensen's head injury. Reyes knew they had maybe 5 minutes before the flare died out and the enemy regrouped. The dry riverbed, marked by a scattering of white stones and scrub brush, appeared below them. a blessed, open expanse in the suffocating jungle. As they burst out of the tree line and onto the stony riverbed, they collapsed, gasping. The silence returned instantly, but this time it was different. It wasn't the eerie, psychological silence of the hunter. It was the open, exposed silence of a potential landing zone, broken only by the sound of Reyes frantically tearing a panel of fluorescent orange signaling cloth from his pack. He spread it across the white stones, then grabbed his rifle. They were too exposed. Reyes directed Jensen to crawl into a slight depression formed by the curve of the riverbank, offering minimal cover. Reyes dropped to his belly, scanning the tree line they had just left. He knew the ghost, or whoever was left of the pursuing force, would be right there, lining up the shot. He raised the M16, bracing it against a small rock, waiting. Time stretched into a horrible, agonizing molasses. Then Reyes heard it, the low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a helicopter, faint at first, then growing louder, cutting through the vast empty air. It was a UH-1 Huey, a heavenly, glorious sound of mechanical rescue. Reyes screamed, a raw, primal yell of relief, and fired a short, sharp burst of celebratory fire into the air, a final, defiant rejection of the silence that had tried to consume them. The helicopter appeared, a dark, churning shadow cutting across the blue sky. It banked sharply toward their orange marker. But just as the Huey began its descent, the final, inevitable counterattack came. Not from the front, but from the left flank, where Reyes had been distracted by the air support. A volley of AK-47 fire erupted from the dense undergrowth, stitching the dirt near their position. Reyes returned fire blindly, aiming toward the noise, realizing that the ghost hadn't been working alone after all, or perhaps the noise of the flare had simply brought the larger enemy patrol down on their heads. The Huey, alerted by the ground fire, flared its nose and dropped rapidly, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and stones. The door gunner opened up, the M60 spitting white-hot tracers into the jungle line. Reyes grabbed Jensen and hauled him toward the landing skids, the wind from the rotor wash deafening, pushing them down. They stumbled into the cabin, the sheer, overwhelming noise of the helicopter finally drowning out the silent screams that had plagued them for days. As the Huey lifted off, Reyes looked down one last time. Through the dust, he saw a single figure rise from the tree line, a dark shape holding a rifle, illuminated briefly by the helicopter spotlight before the jungle swallowed him whole. The ghost, or the man who had been hunting them, had survived. He had lost the kill, but Reyes knew with chilling certainty that the enemy had won the psychological war.